So reflect on that now when COVID is easing. It seems 1483 had its share of thuggery. Alan and Rhiannon will tell of royal skullduggery.
Excellent.
Right, Alan, we're going to hand over to Alan, but could I just tell Alan that yesterday afternoon, Mary and I drove past the Tower of London.
Oh.
And Mary tells me that no one knows who killed the princesses. So you've got a different story.
Okay. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you.
Hi,
Everyone.
And thank you very much for the dog roll. That's good. Good thing getting funny. And Rhiannon's here as well, so I'll just leave it there.
Hi.
Okay.
Alan,
I'm just guessing you have
I'm
sense
gonna mute
stage.
everyone, Alan, so you need to unmute yourself. Do you want to unmute yourself, Alan? Because I've just muted you. Alan, could you unmute, please?
Yeah, okay, sorry, it's a bit slow. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and if you can't see it, if somebody shouts out, and then hopefully we'll be able to get started. Okay, so here we go. And then, so you should be able to see that. Is anybody not able to see that? If you can't see it, then shout out, and I'll.
You can see it all.
There we go. Brilliant. Okay. So I'm going to talk tonight about the Princes in the Tower. It's a murder mystery. It's what I've called it, and it's always been a good murder mystery. And when I first started teaching at school in the late 80s and early 90s, it was a lesson that was one of my favorites. I used to get a couple of my colleagues in, and there'd be the three of us at the front, and we'd pretend to be experts, and we'd present our opinions, and then the children would have to analyze the evidence and work out who they thought the murderer was. It's gone out of fashion a bit recently. I'm not quite sure why, but so I haven't taught it for a very long time. But I still find it a fascinating mystery, because the Princes in the Tower, if you were to go back to 1483, were the two most important people in the Kingdom of England. Edward V, the elder brother, was the king. He was the rightful king, and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was his heir, and if the elder brother died, he would be the next king. But they disappeared, and they disappeared in the summer of 1483, and we don't really know what happened to them. One theory relates to a set of bones that were found in the Tower of London, and these bones were the ones that are now in Westminster Abbey. So if you go along to Westminster Abbey, you'll see this urn and you'll see this plaque that says that traditionally these are the bones of Edward V and his younger brother. Two sets of bones were found in 1674. They were found under a staircase, which is roughly ties in with evidence from Thomas More to say that this is where the boys were buried after they were murdered. And it was accepted in 1674 that these were the bodies, these were the bones, and 4 years later, 1678, they were moved to Westminster Abbey, and the urn on the left was designed by Wren. And there the bones remained until 1933, when they were disinterred. The man at the time, the Dean of Westminster Abbey, wanted to have a look at the bones and see whether they really were the bones of the Princes in the Tower. They examined them. They found that the ages were roughly right. So they were bones of two children, one of whom was 13 years old, one of whom was 10 years old, and that roughly coincides with the ages of the princes when they disappeared. But we don't know if these are the bones of the boys or not. The person who was examining the bones was definitely trying to find evidence that they were the bones of the princes in the Tower. And one of the things where he said it is them is that when he examined the front of the skulls, he could see that there were all bloodstains there. And the tradition was that the princes were suffocated And if a person is suffocated, the minor blood vessels in their face tend to burst, and that stains the skull behind it. But we don't know whether they're the bones of the princes or not. No DNA testing has ever been carried out. And I couldn't find any evidence to say that anybody was interested in disinterring these bones again. So we have the two most important people in the kingdom disappear in 1483, and nobody knows what happened to them. The assumption is that they were murdered. And I've got 4 portraits here. The portrait on the left is the one by Millet, a Victorian portrait painter in the 19th century. And we have a rather sentimentalized view of what the boys are like. You can see the staircase, they're looking scared. And Victorian viewers of this portrait would be familiar with the story, and they'd be thinking, well, something awful happened to these boys. And according to Thomas More, this is the staircase where they were buried after they were killed. So we have a Victorian portrait, and then we have the 3 main suspects when it comes to the murder. We have Richard III, the man in the centre. He's their uncle. He is the younger brother of the prince's father, Edward IV. We have Henry VII, who came to the throne in 1485 after Richard III's death. And some people, particularly the Richard III Society, favour him as the murderer. And then bottom right, we probably have the least likely suspect, but still a suspect, and he's the Duke of Buckingham, who was Richard's right-hand man in the summer of 1483. So we have 3 main suspects who we need to try and disentangle what happened in the past and see which of them is most likely to have killed the princes. It's most likely that they were killed in the summer of 1483, and these 3 men are most likely to have been the possible suspects. Henry VII, if he's the murderer, it depends on the princes still being alive 2 years later in 1485, when Henry VII became king. But more of that later. Now, for Shakespeare, which is probably where most people get their view of Richard III, he's in absolutely no doubt that Richard III is a murderer, that he murdered his own nephews, and this is the description of Richard in Shakespeare's immortal language. So he's rudely stamped, he's curtailed of this fair proportion. In other words, he's short, he's deformed. This refers to the tradition that Richard III was a hunchback, and he's so awful that even the dogs bark at him as he goes by. The picture I've picked out for you is one of Anthony Sher, who won an award for his portrayal of Richard III. We were fortunate enough to see him in the 1980s, I think it was, and he was absolutely incredible. You'll see that what he did was he made Richard's disability a part of the character. He had 2 crutches, and he would just swing around on the stage. And the way the lighting was done and the way Sher acted it was he looked like a giant spider when he was swinging around with on these 2 crutches. And lots of other actors have certainly portrayed Richard. Kevin Spacey, very out of fashion at the moment. Seen him in Richard III. Seen Richard Lester as Richard III. He was my favourite. And someone whose name has just escaped me as well. But lots of famous actors have played Richard III. Ian McKellen's another one, and lots of other people have played him as well. The murder in the play doesn't take place on stage, and it's probably more effective because of that. It leaves it to your imagination as to what actually happened. It's described by Tyrrell, who history describes as the murderer. He's the person who's most likely to have actually done the deed. And we have a description here of what happened. These 2 henchmen, Dighton and Forrest, did this piece of butchery. They were fleshed villains, bloody dogs, and even the villains wept to see the children lying there like gentle babes, holding each other in their alabaster innocent arms. So Shakespeare really lays it on thick here, but it does get over the horror of two teenage boys, one of them 13, one of them 10 years old, in Shakespeare's view, being murdered by their own uncle, the very man who's supposed to be protecting them. So Shakespeare, in absolutely no doubt that Richard III is the main suspect. And like I say, I taught about Richard in the 1980s and 1980s, and then he rather went out of fashion. I changed schools, taught a different syllabus. And my interest was reawakened when Richard III's body was found. And I still find it absolutely incredible that this actually happened. Richard was killed at Bosworth, and tradition had it that he'd been buried in a Greyfriars Abbey, and that at the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, when Henry VIII shut them all down, the tradition was that Richard's bones had been thrown into the river, into the local river, and that was the end of that. But the archaeologists began to wonder if possibly there might still something be left of the Greyfriars Abbey. Maybe there was something there that was still remained of Richard. And they found a map from 1741, which identified the site of the Greyfriars Abbey, Richard's possible burial place, as it says on the slide. And they compared it with a modern map of Leicester, and there was a car park there. That was where the old Greyfriars Abbey had been. And they started to excavate the car park. So at the top left, we have our picture of the cars there before they started digging it up. And they started you can see at the bottom left, we've got the archaeological excavation taking place. And they found a body, which is the person, the skeleton here on the right-hand side. And incredibly, this body was found under the R, one of the R's in car park. And so we got all sorts of weird conspiracy theories, but R is Latin for Rex, and was there a Rex buried underneath the R in the car park? And they did DNA testing on this skeleton that they'd found. And again, incredibly, they'd managed to find a DNA sample from a woman living in Canada who was a direct descendant of Richard III's younger sister. You have to go in the female line, of course, if you're doing DNA, because the female line is proven, whereas in the male line, for reasons I'm sure you can work out, you don't know whether the child is that of the father until DNA testing comes along in the 1990s. Before then, it was always an assumption, of course. And so what we have is a skeleton which modern archaeologists, modern forensic scientists were able to prove was an ancestor of this woman who was a direct descendant of Richard III's younger sister. And so most likely, as far as you can ever prove this sort of thing, this is the skeleton of Richard III. And so they'd found the skeleton of Richard III in a car park in Leicester, and it was just incredible when this news broke. I mean, I don't know whether you remember it or not, but I was completely astonished. I never thought that anything like this would happen. And Richard was buried in the cathedral at Leicester. And I remember at the time thinking, well, this is a bit incongruous. Richard III is thought to have been a murderer. He's thought to have murdered his own nephews. And yet this reinterment is taking place. There's a televised memorial service. It's held in the presence of the Archbishop of Canterbury and senior members of other Christian denominations. And the Queen sends a message of goodwill. So I did find this a little odd. But anyway, we love our history. We love our royal history in particular. And this is Richard III being given a burial, the sort of burial that befits a king, I suppose you would argue, and what people would argue now. What they also did before they buried Richard was they carried out various forensic tests on the skeleton once they'd done the DNA testing to try and work out what Richard was like when he was alive and how he died. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, Richard was killed in battle in August 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth. He was fighting against the future Henry VII, and he couldn't trust his own soldiers for reasons that we shall see. And he sees Richard is with his household bodyguard. It's the best armed knights that he has, about 300 men. And he sees that Henry VII, or Henry Tudor, has become slightly isolated from the rest of the Lancastrian army. So he leads a charge, 300 men with Richard at the front, and they charge, and Richard is attempting here to kill his main rival to the throne, Henry Tudor. It's a desperate last-minute gamble. It just must give you an idea about the mindset of the man, that he's so worried about the loyalty of his own troops that he's going to risk all with one cavalry charge. He's going to risk his own life as well. And Richard got pretty close to Henry Tudor. The chronicles tell us that the Henry Tudor's standard bearer, the man who will be closest to Henry Tudor, was killed, reputedly by Richard III, and he got very close. But then Lord Stanley, who was supposed to be fighting for Richard, his men swept him from the side, killed his household, and killed Richard as well. Now, if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, this is roughly the sort of armor that Richard would have been wearing at the Battle of Bosworth. And you'll see he's covered head to foot in plate steel. It's incredibly expensive, could only possibly be afforded by a king and his major supporters, and it gives you head-to-toe protection. But what happened to Richard was that his horse was killed under him, he was knocked to the ground, and then, don't look too closely if you're feeling a bit squeamish about this. He was knocked to the ground, his helmet was knocked off, okay? They would have cut off the leather straps that held the helmet onto his head, onto his shoulders, and then he was butchered, basically. There are sword strikes, dagger strikes, and at the back of his skull was the wound that probably killed him. It's from a halberd, which is the weapon you can see in the bottom right-hand corner with a sharp spike, and that's probably the wound that killed him. And there were various wounds that they thought were probably were inflicted on the body after he was dead. The rumor had it that his body was stripped naked so that everybody could see he was dead, put on a horse, and then somebody stabbed him in the buttocks to show the ultimate disrespect for him. But one of the amazing things about the discovery of the skeleton is that Richard had scoliosis. Shakespearean tradition had it that Richard had a hunchback, and you can see here that that Richard had scoliosis. It's a curvature of the spine. Probably he would have been able to function fairly normally. He would have been able to walk. He would have been able to ride a horse. He would have been able to swing his weapons. But what scoliosis does is it restricts lung capacity. So no matter how fit he was, how strong he was, his stamina would not be equal to the people around him. And in a medieval battle, this would be a severe handicap. This is how Richard meets his end at the Battle of Bosworth. So this is our Shakespearean Richard. That's what I started off with. And I've moved on to our historical Richard. This is how he died. But what we need to do is we need to get away from the Shakespearean Richard. We need to get away from the dreadful circumstances of his death and think about how likely it is that he's the man who bears responsibility for murdering his own nephews. And I think what's really important here is the context. And the context is that the historical Richard lived in extremely violent times. He took place in his first battle when he was only 18 years old, and he's killed in battle at a relatively young age of 33. And Richard grew up He was born in 1452, and he grew up during the Wars of the Roses. Now, the Wars of the Roses, the name is a Victorian invention. And if you look at the picture down at the bottom, this is a modern painting. I think it was actually from one of my Ladybird history books. And you'll see that the man on the left is holding a white rose for the House of York, and the men on the right a red rose for the House of Lancaster. But contemporaries didn't call it the Wars of the Roses. It's essentially a dynastic struggle between the House of Lancaster. Henry VI on the left is the king when Richard is born in 1452, and the House of York, which is ultimately victorious, and Edward IV, Richard's eldest brother, becomes king. And so we have a dynastic struggle, an extremely violent dynastic struggle between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And if you are interested in this, here's a family tree. Both houses are descended from the Edward III, king in the 14th century. The House of Lancaster is descended from the third son, and the House of York is descended from the second son. But crucially, in the female line, so that doesn't count, or does it count or not in 15th century genealogy? It's not entirely clear. So York is descended from the second and the fourth son. So we have a dynastic struggle between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And we call this, for convenience sake, we call it the Wars of the Roses. It started off in 1455, goes on and off for 32 years, and it's a pretty bloody business. I've listed out for you the battles that took place during the Wars of the Roses. And historians think that something like 2.5% of the population of England was killed in the Wars of the Roses. It's incredibly difficult to calculate this, but if we were to put that into modern day terms with England's population today, just the population of England, that is about 1,350,000 people who were killed. It's not the bloodiest time in English history. During the Civil War in the 17th century, something over 2 million people were killed. But it's certainly a very unstable time. And at the bottom left, we had 5 changes of monarch in 25 years, and we had 3 of those monarchs had a violent or a suspicious death, including Richard III himself, of course. And at the bottom right, this is the Battle of Towton. This was the bloodiest day in English history until the Somme in 1916. And 28,000 people were killed at Towton. It was by far and away the bloodiest battle of the war. I remember we're talking about 28,000 people from a population of about 2 million. So this is a lot of people. And it was fought in a snowstorm, Palm Sunday in 1460. And basically the Yorkists won. Extremely bloody battle. You get an idea of the sorts of battles that took place in the Wars of the Roses. We've got the longbow, which is still dominates the battlefield. And then you can see the men at arms in varying degrees of armor. There's nobody covered head to foot there in armor because it's so incredibly expensive. But these are the times that Richard lived in. So he grew up, his entire life was dominated by the Wars of the Roses. And he was surrounded by violent death. The people who were particularly affected by the Wars of the Roses were the higher nobility. And attainder is a really powerful weapon that's used against the losers. Basically, if an act of attainder is brought against you, then you are a traitor. And you are disinherited. So if you lose the battle and you're attainted, then it's not just you that dies; it's your entire family that is disinherited as well. And land inheritance was crucially important to the aristocracy in the 15th century, as it still is today. And I've just listed out for you the number of Richard's close relatives who were killed. So his father and older brother killed at the Battle of Wakefield, and they chopped their heads off and they put them on Micklegate, which is in York, and put paper crowns on them to mock the Yorkist pretensions to the crown. His cousins, through his mother, his cousins Warwick and Montague are killed at the Battle of Barnet. The Lancastrian Prince of Wales is killed in battle. Henry VI is murdered in the Tower. And the list just goes on. So Richard's older brother, Duke of Clarence, is executed by his own brother, believe it or not. And tradition has it that he was murdered drowned in a butt of Mondsey wine. So when we're looking at the life and times of Richard III, we can see that he lived in very violent and very dangerous times. And the temptation for Richard, presumably, would be to think that politics was just an extension of violence. And so possibly we should bear this in mind when we're thinking about whether he's the main suspect in the murder of the princes. But anyway, things have settled down in the Wars of the Roses. 1471, Henry VI has been murdered. His only direct male heir has been killed in battle. Edward IV, who's Richard's elder brother, has been king. And we've had peace for 12 years. And probably we'd be expecting for peace a bit longer yet. Edward IV is a fit man. He's admired for his athletic ability. He's 6 foot tall, which is unusual in medieval times, and he is expected to live for a very long time. But his main problem is that he's a glutton. He's one of these medieval monarchs who absolutely stuffs himself, goes off behind a screen, makes himself sick, and comes back out and starts eating again. And in the spring of 1483, he has a stroke, and a month later, he's dead. And at this point, we have a crisis. He leaves 2 male heirs, great, but they're not old enough. The oldest one is only 13, and tradition has it that he's not yet really old enough to rule. Medieval tradition said you reached male adulthood when you were about 16. It was a variable judgment that you could be younger or older than that, but 16 seems to be the most accepted age. Now, Edward IV had been aware that this was a problem, that he was leaving a minor who was an heir. So he turned to Richard. Richard was his trusted younger brother. He's Duke of Gloucester is Richard at this point. Richard has stuck by Edward IV through thick and thin. So when Edward IV was kicked off the throne in 1469, he had to flee to Flanders, what's today is the Netherlands, and he had so few followers and so little money that he had to give his cloak to the ship's captain to persuade him to sail across the channel to safety in the Netherlands. And Richard is one of the people who is stuck by Edward no matter what happens. So Edward IV trusts his younger brother. And what he says is Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is going to be the protector until Edward V reaches majority. So Richard III, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, I have to call him, is going to be the king's protector for about 3 years. But the problem is that the House of York in 1483 is a house divided. It's not at peace with itself. Richard himself, he's a seasoned warrior and politician. Like I've already said, he's loyal to his eldest brother, and he has been granted since 1471 what we call a palatinate in the north. Now, this makes him extremely powerful. It makes him the second man in the kingdom, basically. The north, because of the ongoing border wars with Scotland, has a reservoir of trained and experienced fighting men. And a palatinate means that the king's writ does not run in the north. So Richard is able to implement the king's law on his own behalf. It's almost like setting up a little kingdom in the north for him. He's been busy in the north. The north was where the Lancastrians had their most of support. He's pacified the north, and he has been absent from court down in London for most of the 1470s. He's not been around at the centre of power, but he has a separate power base in the north. One of the problems is, though, is that he hates and fears the Woodvilles. Now, the Woodvilles are the Queen's family. Edward IV had married Elizabeth in 1464 for no good reason. other than the fact that she was meant to be extremely beautiful. And this was a severe political miscalculation by Edward IV. Her relatives had been enriched. It had split the Yorkist party in 1469, and many of the traditional Yorkists hate them. They see them as parvenus, upstarts, and they don't trust them at all. But the key trump card that the Woodvilles have in 1483 is that they control the future Edward V. As Prince of Wales, he's at Ludlow, and Lord Rivers, the senior member of the Woodville family, has control over Edward V at Ludlow. So that's their trump card. And as we shall see, it's a very important trump card. And then the final division in the house is Lord Hastings. There's no extant picture of Lord Hastings, it's just a drawing on a manorial roll. And he's the man who controls the money. He's been loyal to Edward IV, he's loyal to his will. He's the Chamberlain of the Exchequer, which essentially means he controls central government and the money in Edwardian England. And he hates and fears the Woodvilles too. So we have three groups of people, three separate power groups who all hate and fear each other. And we have a minor king, and we've had a tradition of violence being used to settle political differences. So we have a problem. And what is absolutely fascinating, in my view, about the spring and summer of 1483 is that you can see a plot unfolding. Now, the end result of the plot is that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, ends up being king. But just to untangle a bit the series of events, Edward IV dies, and what the Woodvilles try to do is they try and overturn the will. And Richard is in the north, he's distant from court, and what they plan to do, the Woodvilles, as far as they can do, we can suggest, is they're going to get Edward V down to London as quickly as possible, get him crowned in Westminster Abbey, and not have Richard as protector at all. Now, Richard, at this point, the alarm bells would really start to ring, because the price of political failure in the late 15th century, during the Wars of the Roses, will be death, and his family will be attainted. So not only he will die, but his wife and child will be destitute. So Richard, we don't know whether he plans to seize the crown at this point, but certainly at this point, he will be a very worried man. So he sets off from the north, sets off from York, or sets off from Middleham, which is where his castle is in Yorkshire, and he arranges to meet Rivers and Edward V at Stony Stratton down in the Midlands. And everything looks very peaceful. And what Richard does with his close ally Buckingham is he tricks the Woodvilles. They seize control of the king and send his male Woodville relatives off in captivity. But at this point, you could argue that all Richard is doing is protecting his rights under the will. The will has made him Lord Protector. There's no doubt that the Woodvilles have planned to overturn the will. All he's doing is he's implementing the terms of the will. And it comes down to London with King Edward V, the Hastings, who's in alliance with Richard at this point, because he's loyal to the will as well, helps him. The Woodvilles try and raise an army. So the Woodvilles are the people who are trying to use violence at this point, but fail. And the Queen flees into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. And Richard is installed as Lord Protector by the Royal Council, and the coronation of Edward V is delayed, but then, you know, we've had a lot of problems, we've had all this politicking, maybe this is reasonable. And Buckingham, who's helped Gloucester, remember he's our third suspect, is handsomely rewarded. And at the end of May, it looks as though Gloucester's going to be protector, Edward V is going to be crowned, and it's all going to be peaceful. But in June, things start to change. Gloucester writes to York, asking for extra troops, and at a meeting in the Royal Council, Richard stands up and accuses Hastings, the most important administrator in the realm, the man who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer in today's terms, in control of the royal household, says, "You're a traitor." And armed men burst in, drag Hastings out of the room, drag him outside, put him over a log of wood, and chop his head off. So this is an indication of the level of violence that England has descended to. Hastings is the most important administrator in the realm, and he's simply been dragged out, put over a log of wood, and had his head chopped off. And that's it. That's the end of him. And the princes of the Tower, who are the princes who are at this point are in the Tower, and remember, the Tower at this point is not just a prison. The main purpose of the Tower is as a royal residence. They are in the Tower. But things start to get a bit murky now, because at some point in the second half of June, the prince's attendants debarred from access, and then Richard delays Edward V's coronation yet again. And then we have breaking news on June the 22nd, to everybody's great shock and horror, the nervousness and fear that must have been existent in London in the summer of 1483 can only be guessed at. And the canon of St. Paul's preaches a sermon and says that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is the only legitimate heir of York, because the Edward IV had married somebody before he married Elizabeth Woodville. And so basically he's a bigamist. And that means that his sons are illegitimate and can't possibly be the heirs to the throne. And for good measure, the canon of St. Paul, who's clearly acting on Gloucester's orders, accuses Richard's own mother of having had Edward IV illegitimately as well, because she's supposed to have slept with an archer from Calais. So not very attractive behaviour here by Richard. Not only is he claiming that his elder brother is a bigamist, he's also claiming that his own mother had a child outside of marriage while she was married to his own father. I mean, and Richard's mother is still alive at this point, so goodness knows what she thought about all of this. But then things get bloody again. The leading Woodvilles are executed, and Richard sits in the King's chair in Westminster Hall. And then we have a letter to the captain of Calais, we still have this, saying that Edward V is no longer legitimate. Troops from the north have arrived in London, about 6,000 of them, and Richard III is crowned as king. So we've gone from April the 9th with the death of Edward IV and the Woodvilles attempting to overturn Edward IV's will, which made Gloucester protector. Gloucester has established his rights as protector, and then, shock horror, the news has come out that the princes are illegitimate, so Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is the only legitimate heir to the throne. And on the 6th of July, Richard is crowned as king. So we have a plot unfolding that we don't really know what Richard's motives were. Was he a badly frightened man? I mean, clearly, if the Woodvilles had managed to overturn the will, the first person they would have tried to kill, track down, would have been Richard himself and his family. They would have attainted him. And Edward V, remember, has been brought up by the Woodvilles. He's never met his uncle. There's no reason to trust him. And I'm sure the Woodvilles have been busy whispering poison in his ears. But whether Richard is a frightened man, a desperate man, or a Machiavellian monster, as Shakespeare suggests, we don't really know. There's not the evidence there to find out. But what we do know is that he's king. And as king, he's not a success. He spends 2 years trying to establish himself on the throne. He's faced with an immediate rebellion from Buckingham, who's supposed to be his most loyal supporter, and disaffected southern Yorkist gentry, men who were being loyal to Edward IV and to Lord Hastings. There's rebellion. Richard's only heir dies at about 12 years old in 1484. His wife dies in 1485. So now he has no wife and no heir, and he's betrayed and defeated at Bosworth. So whatever we think of Richard, his taking of the throne did not result in any peace and security for him. It must have been, we have accounts of him praying desperately before Bosworth, the night before Bosworth, hoping for success on the morrow and that his enemies will be defeated. With the princes, well, they've been seen in the Tower in June 1483. Their attendants have been taken away. And then by the summer of 1483, nobody sees them at all. An attempt to rescue them in late July fails. So the likelihood is that sometime during June 1483, they have been murdered. And these are the two most important people in the realm. And it gives you an indication of the insecurity and violence at the time, that they can just be disappeared, that somebody could murder them and we don't know what happened. Rumours spread they'd been murdered, and these rumours are actually spread to France. The King of France hears them and believes them, and all state that Richard has killed the princes, bar one, as we shall see. So contemporary sources think that Richard is guilty, and most of Shakespeare's story of what happened to princes comes from a man called Thomas Moore, who wrote the history of Richard III in about 1513. And this is where we get the story of Tyrrell being the murderer, the princes being smothered, and that they're buried at the foot of a stair, which, if you remember, is where we had the bodies from that are now in Westminster Abbey, where they were found. So there's no doubt in Moore's mind that Richard is guilty, and contemporaries accept that he's guilty as well. So the Chancellor of France names Richard as the murderer. That's an Estates General, which is like a French Parliament, in January 1484. And Elizabeth Woodville, remember, she's the mother. She had been of the princes. She'd been Edward IV's queen, and she supported Henry Tudor in his campaign against Richard III. It's highly unlikely she would have done this if her sons had still been alive. So the probability is that they've died in the summer of 1483. We know that Richard was away from court when the princes disappeared. So after his coronation, he went on a tour of the country. Highly unlikely that he'd murdered them in person, but the princes are under guard. He's controlled by his men, and he had these strict instructions that they are not to see anyone without his explicit approval. So even if he doesn't murder them directly, it's unlikely it could have been murdered without his knowledge. Okay, so Richard looks the most likely suspect. The only other person who's named in a contemporary chronicle is the Duke of Buckingham, and he is Richard's right-hand man in the summer of 1483, who then rebels against him later on. And some historians have suggested that Buckingham was the person who murdered the princes. He murdered the princes in order to blame Richard, and also because Buckingham has a claim to the throne himself. It all seems a bit unlikely, really. It's difficult to see how Buckingham could make this happen when Richard has control over the Tower, and control over access to the princes, and the princes are under guard by Richard's men. The other man that has been put forward as likely to be a plausible alternative, as Pollard says, a historian, is the only plausible alternative to Richard III. He marries the prince's eldest sister in 1486 to enforce his claim to the throne. This is where the Tudor rose comes from. He combines the York and the Lancastrian rose to create the Tudor rose, and he's really the only plausible alternative to Richard III. And Markham, who was a historian in the 19th century, he suggested that the princes were still alive when Henry Tudor became Henry VII, and that they were actually executed by Henry VII. his basic argument is that there's no reason for Richard III to murder the princes because they're illegitimate. And so everybody knows they're illegitimate, and so there's no need to kill them. But when Henry Tudor becomes king, he has to kill them because they are illegitimate or not, they're still Yorkist descendants, and he needs to get rid of them. Okay, and there's all sorts of suggestions that the prince's mother knew that the princes were still alive, that Henry had killed them. And so in February 1487, he confiscates all the lands and possessions as a confined in a nunnery, which often happens to female political opponents at the time. But this is all highly speculative, and Markham's main idea was that he was saying, well, if Henry VII became king in 1485, surely he'd shout to the rooftops that the princes had been murdered by Richard III. But you know, the princes are the brothers of Henry's new wife. People knew who'd killed the princes. They knew they were already dead. No contemporaries suggest that Henry was the murderer. And surely the princes, the two most important people in the realm in April 1483, is it possible for keeping them alive in secret for 2 years, when Richard himself, what is widely rumoured to have killed them? So again, Pollard, none of this deserves serious consideration. Access to the tower is what's key, and Richard is the person who has access to the tower, and he's responsible for the safekeeping of his nephews. And what the reality is that the princes have disappeared. Richard is believed to be the murderer, and he's responsible for their welfare in the eyes of contemporaries, and he has failed in that responsibility because most likely they're dead, and just about everybody, but all the contemporary sources believe they're dead by the summer of 1483. And this rumour really handicapped Richard's efforts at security. People regarded him as a usurper. Edward IV's supporters amongst the Yorkist gentry were so disgusted with Richard's behaviour that they'd rather have a Lancastrian Henry Tudor on the throne than support Richard III, the Yorkist heir. And the mystery really is that if we look at Richard's options in the summer of 1483, what choices does he have? He can do nothing. He can let the Woodvilles stop him being protector. He can let them crown Edward V and take over political power. And if he does that, the likelihood is that they will move against him very quickly. They fear and hate each other. They would probably trump up some charge against him, have him executed, and has his family attainted. So if he does nothing, he's probably going to die and his family will be destitute. He can claim the protectorship, which is what he does initially in April, May 1483, but that protectorship will end as soon as Edward V reaches his majority. And so the longest time he's got is probably 3 years. And then Edward V, who's been brought up by his Woodville relatives, will become king, the protectorship will end, and you'll probably end up with Richard executed and his family attainted. Or he can seize the crown. And is it possible to speculate that once he seized the crown, he has to dispose of the princes, and that's his least worst option? The alternative seems to be certain death, or I'll be king, and possibly I will be able to survive, and my family will be able to survive as well. So that the most kind interpretation is that Richard is acting in this way because he has no choice. The least kind interpretation is actually he's Machiavellian, and he wants to be king, and he doesn't mind murdering his own nephews in order to gain the crown. So I think if you look at the context in the summer of 1483, it's pretty clear that Richard is the most likely suspect. And most current historians think that as well. And I've just listed out for you there the historians who regard him as the most likely culprit. Now, we're never going to know for sure. And there was an attempt, I think it was in there was a TV program some time ago which put Richard on trial, put him in a court of law. And the court of law said, well, not proven. You can't prove that Richard III was guilty of murdering the princes. And I don't think we ever will be able to definitively prove that he did it, because it's 550 years ago and we don't even have the bodies. But I think Richard III, he certainly has the motive. Remember that the alternative is probably to execution and his family to be destitute. He has the opportunity in the summer of 1483. He is the experienced soldier and statesman. He has a power base in the north, which enables him to call on large numbers of battle-hardened and experienced troops. And finally, if he's not guilty, why not just produce them? There's lots of rumors going around in France, Venice, in all sorts of royal courts in Europe that the princes are dead. But Richard never said, okay, they're not dead, because here they are, just bring them out in public, which strongly suggests that he can't. Because by the summer of 1483, most likely they're already dead. And by late 1483, Richard can't produce them because they're no longer alive. But the postscript to this story is, and then the last bit is that the prince's own mother believes Richard is guilty. I mean, it's all rather strange that all these people, all these actors that I've been talking about, they all know each other, and they all quite frequently are married to each other's relatives. And I think it must have been a bit like the mafia, really, at times, that on the surface, everybody says how much they love each other and how much they enjoy each other's company. But underneath, it's all going on, and violence will break out very quickly, because the alternative, if you lose, then the alternatives are too dreadful to think about. And Elizabeth supported Henry Tudor because she's certain her sons are dead. And if they're dead by the summer of 1483, then Richard really is the only main suspect. And the postscript to all of this is we get Henry VII. And many historians would argue that Henry VII is probably one of the most capable monarchs who ever ruled. His victory at Stoke in 1487 is effectively the end of the Wars of the Roses. And he re-establishes the authority of the crown. We've had 3 kings in about 25 years, and 3 of them have been killed or violently or murdered. And Henry VII establishes a crown where the king is not violently overthrown for another 250 years. So that's 10 times the length, or 10 times the length of security compared with the Wars of the Roses. Not until Charles I is executed in 1649 is another English monarch violently overthrown. So Henry VIII is able to break with Rome. He's able to have a minor in Edward VI rule peacefully. He's able to have a woman rule peacefully, which was astonishing in the prospects of the time. And all of that comes from the foundations that Henry VII laid. Not a nice man, not someone you'd want to cross, but an extremely effective ruler, and certainly a lot more effective than Richard was. Okay, so that's the end. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and then if anybody wants to ask any questions, then
First of all, thanks very much, Alan. That was very interesting. I'm now inviting Rotary members to dispute Alan's theory.
It's good job my grandfather wasn't listening to this, because the first thing he would ever ask someone he met for the first time was what their opinion of Richard III was, because he was a great protagonist for Richard III, and had always taken his side. But I don't recall ever getting into the specific question of the princes. But you make a very convincing case.
Yeah, I mean, I was brought up in Yorkshire, and York was Richard III's main source of support during his reign. And when Richard was killed at Bosworth, York says that, to record in the city annals how sad they are about all of this and how desperately unhappy that Richard has died. So he did have his supporters. And there's the Richard III Society, which still campaigns to say that he is not the murderer. And there's many novels being written. There's Josephine Tay's novel that was written in the 50s, I think. And then there was a TV series recently, that The White Queen, I think it was, about Elizabeth Woodville, about how whether or not Richard was murdered or not. I think if you look at the historical context, motive, opportunity, and not much choice, really.
Well, Peter Latham was around in 1483, and I think he's got an alternative theory.
Yes, fascinating talk. History, and particularly this period, really fascinates me. I don't dispute your arguments at all. In fact, obviously, clearly, I don't have the background and knowledge you have, but I couldn't in any way start to challenge what you said or the conclusions you've come to. But what does fascinate me is the progress of history. And I think most of us will agree, although not a nice man, Henry VII was a transformer. He's a monarch who transformed the country. And I just wonder whether you're a believer in the inevitability of the emergence of countries and the development of countries, or whether it is individual people like Henry VII, who, had he not defeated Richard III, the progress of the world would have been completely different, and Western civilization might not have evolved. It's a big question, but
yeah, that's a pretty big claims for Henry VII to say he's responsible for Western civilization. I mean, I'm not sure I could agree with that. I mean,
I didn't say it was responsible.
there's nothing.
I said it without him, it wouldn't.
It would be different. I mean, I don't believe anything is inevitable in history. I mean, inevitability in history really comes from the Marxist view, in that history is predetermined and that history is a scientific subject. If you understand the past, then you predict the future. And people don't really believe that before. Now they see much more the result of chance and happenstance in history. But Henry Tudor was an extremely effective ruler, and he was able to put the nobility in their place through a series of financial instruments. So he would have fines hanging over their head. So even his biggest supporter, the Earl of Oxford, who led his troops at Bosworth, had a £20,000 fine hanging over his head. It was called the system of bonds and recognizances. And Henry trusted nobody and scared everybody. I mean, he probably died at the right time in 1509. You couldn't keep on repressing people the way that Henry VII did. But he does lay the foundations for a very effective monarchy. So I think you can say that if you're going for the great men of history theory, that Henry VII is one of them, and whether or not you would have had a different Henry VII who would have come along and reimposed and restated the authority of the crown in the same way, we don't know. I mean, that's counterfactual history. One of the things that makes England very unusual in the Middle Ages is how powerful the state is, certainly if you compare it with countries like France and Spain, and how centralized the monarchy is, relatively speaking. So the institution is there, you just need someone to come along and use it effectively. So yes, cometh the hour, cometh the man. I think institutions are what enable states to survive and be great. And Henry VII took an existing institution and made it a lot greater.
Okay,
Yeah, just to comment on that. the fact, your view that institutions were resilient is perhaps supported by the fact that the monarchy itself had been in a state of complete turmoil for 30, 35, nearly 40 years. So there must have been something there to run the show in the absence of a stable monarchy. I mean, it had been intermittently stable. I mean, Edward IV had a good enough run at it for certain times to establish some stability, but for the most part, it had been pretty chaotic.
Yeah, I mean, England is remarkably peaceful compared with a lot of its continental neighbours. And one of the reasons why the War of the Roses is such a shock is we're not used to this happening here. The English have been busy invading France for the last 100 years or so and causing chaos there. And they don't expect chaos to arrive on their own doorstep. So the institutions of government, I mean, it's not really, we wouldn't recognise it as such today. There's no paid bureaucracy. It's all run on patronage. But out in the localities, you have royal sheriffs who, in theory, whose power exceeds the power of the local great magnates. What happens is that under Henry VI, by the 1450s, you have a monarch who's lost all the land in France, who has lost the 100 Years' War, is incompetent, and rather than being the figure at the top who settles the faction fighting amongst his great magnates, he becomes identified with one particular faction, and that means that the other factions then start fighting each other and ultimately end up fighting Henry for the crown. So what happens in the 1450s is that royal control gradually breaks down. It's been breaking down for about 20 years, and you get local power feuds. In the north, for example, there's the Percys versus the Nevilles. And there's always a level of violence in England, but the level of violence gets out of control. And ultimately, that level of violence swamps the crown itself, and that becomes the ultimate prize. But what's interesting, I think, about it is that during the Wars of the Roses, there's no attempt to break up the Kingdom of England, for example. There's no attempt to say, well, you have the north and I'll have the south and you can have the east. There's no attempt to partition it. And the ultimate aim is always to take control of the crown rather than to replace it with something else. So that the underlying stability that exists in England continues. And also the fact that there is an English identity, that there's a separate language, and that English people in the 15th century seem to have thought of themselves in some way of being English. Whereas if you're in Spain, you'd be a Catalan and a Basque or a Castilian. In France, you'd be a Breton or someone from Burgundy. England seems to have had something related to a national identity and something that was a centralized state to a greater extent than anywhere else.
Okay, cool. One last question. Teresa? Teresa?
Yes, I have a question. I've found this absolutely fascinating about the balance of power and how it's kept and so on. But all these battles and skirmishes and arguments depended on having support of lots of men and a lot of richness, largely men, because it was hand-to-hand fighting. So when did gunpowder and more modern weapons begin to take effect?
If you look at the Battle of Bosworth, the site of the Battle of Bosworth has changed over the last few years. It's moved 2 miles down the road, which is a bit embarrassing for the Heritage Centre. And one of the reasons they found it was that there were small lead balls about that size that were clearly fired from handguns. And it's really, at the start of the Wars of the Roses, it's all longbows. There's the odd cannon around the place, but they're unreliable, they're heavy, they're slow. It's the longbow that matters. And then what you do is you fire up your longbows, and a trained longbowman can have 3 arrows in the air at the same time. So these are lethal weapons. And by the end of the Wars of the Roses, gunpowder is starting to come in. So when Henry VIII is invading France in the 1540s, for example, when we look at the Mary Rose, there are still longbow-men on the Mary Rose, but more and more cannon are coming in. And by the time you get to Elizabeth's campaigns in the Netherlands in the 1580s, that there are no longbow-men left. So gunpowder, they're using it in the Wars of the Roses, but it tends to be for siege warfare. Longbows are portable and they're more effective. The disadvantage of longbows is that you need trained, fit, healthy men to be able to do it. So if you look at the skeleton of a longbowman, what you'll find is his right shoulder, which way around is it? I think his right arm and shoulder are far more developed than his left arm because of the pulling weight he's put on it. And it takes years of training and to develop the physique and the expertise. Whereas when handguns come in, anybody could shoot a handgun. I could shoot a handgun. Somebody could give me a 2-minute lessons and I could shoot a handgun. A longbow, I wouldn't be able to pull it. I'd never be able to pull it because I'd never built up the strength when I was younger. So longbows are most effective, but when handguns come in, they're cheaper and anybody can do it.
Well, one last. Teresa.
Raise your hand here, maybe.
Yes, Teresa.
Hello. Henry VIII was seemingly an ineffective king. Not Henry VIII, Henry VI, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't think Henry VIII would agree with you on that
Henry,
one. He particularly wouldn't want to marry him.
But his wife kept coming across with armies and keeping the Wars of the Roses going.
I don't think she necessarily keeps the Wars of the Roses going. I mean, Henry marries Margaret of Anjou in the 1440s with the idea that it's going to lead to a peace treaty between him and the King of France, and Henry will preserve his existing lands in Normandy and Gascony down in the south. But the marriage treaty is a failure. And during the 1450s, Henry VI seems to have had some sort of nervous breakdown where he's gone into a catatonic state for 6 months. And Margaret of Anjou at this point gains the reputation of being the she-wolf of France. And she seems to have become one of the main leaders of the Lancastrian cause. And her trump card is her son, another Edward, unfortunately, who is killed at Tewkesbury. And rumour has it that he's not Henry VI's son at all. He's actually the son of the Duke of Somerset. You know, it's not. This is all. You know, it's not exactly happy families. It's where I think it's like the mafia, where they're all married to each other and they're all plotting against each other. But Margaret of Anjou is a really interesting figure because it's unusual in 15th century politics for a woman to play any part other than, to put it crudely, being a bearer of babies. And so Henry VI's incapacity brings Margaret of Anjou to the fore, and Elizabeth Woodville, of course, Edward IV's incapacity, his death in April 1483, brings her to the fore as well. But Margaret of Anjou is quite a sad death. Her son's killed at Tewkesbury, 1471, when he's 18 years old. Her husband is murdered in the Tower. Edward IV locks her up for a while in the nunnery, as you'd expect. And then he sends her back to France to be looked after by her royal relatives, where she dies in obscurity.
And also about Henry VII, he was a very successful king in that he handed over the kingdom with a vast treasury. He was very stingy, and when Henry he passed, we were stable, economically stable, for a long period of time with Henry VII, and Henry VIII just wasted it all going fighting all these battles, and so.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard the nursery rhyme. The king is in his counting house counting out his money. Was it 4 and 20 blackbirds, isn't it? Well, the king in his counting house counting out his money is Henry VII. So even children's nursery rhymes think he was a stingy miser. But when Henry VIII came to the throne, he spent the lot in about 2 years. And even though he dissolved the monasteries, and the monasteries owned about a quarter of the land in England in the 1530s, Henry took the lot and then spent it all in the 1540s on wars. So wars and palaces, what Henry VIII spent it on. And by the time he died in 1547, the crown was more or less bankrupt. So a real wastrel, I'm afraid.
But what about the novel that I've read about that his niece, Elizabeth of York, she was in love with Richard. They say she was in love with Richard III.
Well, I mean, she's his niece for starters. He's the main suspect in killing her brothers. Yeah, she must have been terrified. When Elizabeth Woodville, what she does is, when Richard seizes the princess, she takes her 2 daughters into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, and she'll only come out after Richard has publicly sworn on a Bible in front of as many great men as can be found that she will not be harmed and her daughters will not be harmed. So Elizabeth of York, she must have been pretty frightened during Richard's reign, and her marriage to Henry Tudor in 1486 is a dynastic success because she unites the claims of Lancaster and York.
Lancaster and York, that was sort of the makeup, wasn't it?
Yeah. And then she bears Henry VII 2 sons and 3 daughters, I think it is. Dies in childbirth in about 1502. But she was the higher aristocracy, because they had a largely meat-based diet, lots and lots of protein. They tended to be taller and stronger. So Edward IV was about 6 foot tall. Elizabeth Woodville was about 5'10", which was pretty tall for a woman at the time. And Henry VIII was about 6 foot tall as well, got his height from his mother and his maternal grandfather. So if you'd have seen the higher nobility at that time, one of the things that would have made them stand out is they tended to be taller and bigger because they were eating lots of meat. So Henry VIII, for example, wouldn't touch any food that had come from the ground because he thought that was what peasants ate. And one of the things
Definitely not vegan.
No. I mean, Henry VIII probably ends up with scurvy because his diet is so lacking in fresh fruit and veg. Possibly, probably, we don't know. But one of the things that may have handicapped Richard III is that because of his scoliosis, he was of a smaller stature than people expected a king to be.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Alan. It was fascinating. So we now know who killed the princess.
I think we most probably, yeah.
Our next speaker is Penny Carey, who's the Dean of the School of Law at the University of Hertfordshire, and she's got 2 colleagues coming along with her. So I'm sure the subject has been declared, but I don't recall what it was, but she'll be excellent. And I should let you know that Jim Tatchell is going to take the chair that evening because I'm going to be on holiday. I've been dragged away. So that just leaves me to thank you all for joining tonight and to toast the Queen and Rotary and peace the world over.
Queen and Rotary, peace the world.
The Queen and Rotary.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Alan.
Bye.
Thank you, Alan. I thought that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, man.
Bye. Bye.